Hey everyone, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're tuning in from. Thanks for joining live today as we take a look at Next.js 13. Say hi in the chat, tune in, say where you're tuning in from. Good morning, good afternoon. Glad y'all could join here live today. We are going to talk all things Next.js 13. We're going to take a look at some of the new features, pull up an app, pull up some code, build some stuff live, and most importantly, have plenty of time to answer everyone's questions. Got some folks here from Germany, Portugal, Florida, Edmonton. We've got Mr. Matt here. We've got a bunch of folks tuning in. Thanks for joining. Happy to have y'all here. It's going to be a fun stream. We're just going to build some cool stuff and talk a lot about some of these new features. So without further ado, wow, lots of people tuning in, lots of questions here. Awesome. Well, thanks so much for joining. Wow. There's so many in the chat. I'm glad y'all are here. Let's get into it. So today I want to talk a little bit about everyone who's checking out Next.js 13, the new features that you can take advantage of, and we're going to actually pull up some code and take a look here. So let me get my monitor pulled up over here, and we can kick this off. All right. I have a rough outline here of what I want to talk about, and we'll just kind of make a run through of all the different things and pull up some code. So to start things off here, let me know if this isn't large enough for y'all. What I've done is I have ran create next app to create a brand new Next.js 13 application, and to be the background of my stream, I just have this clip from the keynote when we introduced Next.js 13, and it has that fancy animation, which that can kind of just play in the background as we talk about this crowd. Oh, we even have the closed captioning saying crowd cheers. It's amazing. In case you missed it, we released Next.js 13 at Next.js Conf a few weeks ago. We have a fun little takeover here on the .org homepage with some of the new features we've launched. I particularly enjoy the hover states of all the cards. I think are pretty cool. Turbo Pack is pretty neat if you want to check that out. We can talk about that a little bit today. And there's also some cool Vercel stuff too if you're into that. But the main thing I want to talk about today is Next.js 13. And it includes a few features that you can update and start using today and really take advantage of making your applications faster, as well as a completely new separate app directory that is in beta that you can start exploring some of the future ideas and architecture that we're putting into Next.js. So first and foremost, I just want to talk about the things that are already in Next.js 13 today that you can use without having to check out some of the new features in app. And those are images and fonts. So we'll start with images. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the Next.js image component. It allows you to automatically optimize your images and prevent having layout shift when displaying them on the page. We've really iterated over this API design and the component that we provide to try to make something that's both helps you get a great in-user experience and a fast page load, but also is a joy to work with. And really appreciate all of the feedback, because we got a lot of feedback over the iterations that have ultimately led us to this iteration, which is easier to style. It has less client-side JavaScript, and it's really a re-platforming on the web platform itself. So for example, you can just use native browser lazy loading. You don't need to include client-side JavaScript to do that. So this new image component we've had out for a while, and it is now stable, and it's the default in Next.js 13, and you can upgrade and start using it right away. And I'll show this in a second, but the second is the font module, Next Font. This is a continuation of previous work that we've done to make it easier for developers to use fonts in their applications and automatically optimize them. In the past, it was okay, but we had room for improvement, and I think we've made a big improvement here, a step change with Next.js 13 and the new font system. Specifically, the biggest thing here is the automatic optimization of your fonts by self-hosting them on your own Next.js server or your own infrastructure. And further, zero layout shift because of the size adjust CSS property. So I'm sure you've all seen this. I know I've dealt with it many times on my own sites. You go to a page, you load the page, it looks, okay, and then boom, fonts flicker in and load once they've resolved from Google Fonts or your own self-hosted fonts. It's just a bad experience when the fonts have that layout instability. And really what Next Font is trying to do is make it easier for you to work with fonts without having to go through the hassle of figuring out all these little quirks of how to get really fast fonts. You can basically think about it like all of the little hacks or pieces of knowledge that you would need to do to get the fastest possible fonts in your application. We've kind of condensed all of that and just put it into one component so that you don't have to like read a manual. I actually wrote a blog post on this like a year ago of like some of the tips you can do to get faster web fonts. Why even do that, right? Why not just put it into a component that you can just reuse and take advantage of the latest innovations on the web? And that's really what Next Font is. We'll show that off here in a minute too. There's a couple other smaller things which I think are worth mentioning. One is it's mostly just a DX improvement, but for folks who are using Next Link, which is probably the majority of Next.js developers, to get those snappy client-side page transitions, it was always a piece of community feedback. Like, why do we have to have this A tag that was nested inside the link component? Doesn't the link component just automatically create an A tag? And with Next.js 13, that is now the default. That is how this works. Pretty easy change. But what if we can make it easier? And that's what codemods come in handy for. So one of the big things in kind of our philosophy, I guess, for helping folks move from Next.js 12 to move to Next.js 13 is when you update and you have some of these breaking changes, like you have, a tag is no longer a child of a link. Yes, you can find and replace and go and fix every instance in your code base, or you can just use this npx next code mod new link. This is the name of the specific code mod, and then the actual pages that you want to run this over, whatever directory that is. So in this instance, it's literally the pages directory. The same thing goes for the next image component. So if you upgrade to Next.js 13, the API of this new image component is slightly different. If you want, you can still opt out to the old way of doing this. Or if you want, you can use this new code mod, which is going to allow you to, we have one that opts out to the legacy image, or there's one where you can upgrade to the newest version of the image. So you can kind of choose your own destiny there. I see a question here. Why is it at Next Font and not Next Font? This is an interesting point because one of the features of Next Font is it allows you to use any font from Google Fonts. And you can do this while still self-hosting the font. Now, if this was namespaced as /next/font, so like part of the initial npm i next package, that would increase the page weight, or not the page weight, the install weight of downloading Next. But what if I'm not using font? I don't want to include that because there's quite a few Google fonts. So at least where we've landed right now is that this is a separate package that you install at Next, still namespaced in the Next org, at Next/font, and then you can take advantage of using these features. There is a question, what about middleware? Middleware is still kicking, still supported in Next.js 13, and we've made some API updates based on feedback from the community. So couple simple things, but these simple things I think will really improve the developer experience, making it easier to set headers on the request and being able to respond directly as well too. These were 2 points of feedback I heard quite a few times from folks that you can do in Next.js 13. So basically, TLDR, lots of reasons to check out Next.js 13 and upgrade today, even before we get to what I think a lot of y'all are interested in the app directory and this new kind of mental model of where Next.js is headed. couple other things to just briefly mention. There's a few other smaller breaking changes that you just might want to be aware of. Next.js.org/13 if you want to see the full list. But I realize this is a little small. I'll bump it up. Just looking over here. But basically, React version minimums, Node.js version minimums, like default browser support is just now, modern browsers kind of updating things over time, and a couple other small things. But most of this stuff is pretty self-explanatory. So give this a read. Let me know in the chat if you have any questions about this. But let's take a look at some of these things on my local machine first before we go any further. So again, create next app on the left. Just ran create next app at latest to download the latest code. And I got this directory spun up. So I'm using pnpm here for the sake of that's the package manager that I like. And kind of just pull this up here on the right. Let's first look at images. So I think there's an image component already in, yeah, there is, in create next app. So if we scroll down here, down at the bottom, we have this image. It's the source. It's an SVG file. There's a width and a height. And if I open up the browser dev tools and I go find this image and I inspect it, one of the differences between the image component in Next.js 13 and this newer image component and what you might be used to in Next.js 12 is there is no longer a wrapping element around the image. So in this instance, there is literally an element here that is adding styles to it. This could also go directly on the image if we want to. But previously, this was a lot of feedback, was we want better control over how we style the element, and we don't want any wrapping elements. We want just the native image component. So the cool thing about this is that's now the default, and you don't have to have client-side JS to be able to do lazy loading when this image scrolls into view. So basically not a lot changes, but your application gets faster and hopefully easier to use and style. That's pretty much images. Again, not a lot changed here, but if you have other questions about images, let me know. Let's talk about fonts. Let's actually add some custom fonts into our local application here. It looks like we're just using the default system font here. Let's actually pull something in from Google Fonts. So to do that, I'm going to install Next Font. And yeah, I think we'll do Google Fonts in this instance. We can just do something like enter. So I'll restart my local dev server. I'm going to pull up our app_app file, which is kind of our shared layout for our entire application. More on layouts here very soon. But I can kind of import this from Next Font. And the cool thing here too is maybe I don't want enter, maybe I want some other font. You can see we have this entire list of like all of these different fonts from Google Fonts. So you can kind of pick and choose, whatever you want. I think, is it Railway? Yeah, Railway is another one that's really popular. Roboto is another one that's really popular. I'm kind of partial to enter, and it's just nice that I can just easily import that in here. By default, Next Font uses variable fonts. And I would highly recommend that if you can use a variable font like enter, you should use a variable font. The reason for this is that you don't need to go in here and you don't need to specify, well, variable true is going to be your default here, but you don't have to specify like weight of 400 or weight of 500, for example, because variable fonts can automatically handle that for you. So it doesn't take any arguments in that instance. Here's a couple, I guess I could actually dive into the source here, but yeah, you can have a weight, you can have different styles, which is essentially the font style property, font display property, whether you want it to preload, it's automatically preloaded by default, which helps prevent the layout shift. It can automatically generate your fallback fonts for you. And you can also subset the font either here on the actual instantiation of enter or in your next conf settings, config settings, next conf. So I've got next conf on the brain still. So now that I have this font, I have this declaration of enter, basically you just want to access the class name, right? So in this instance, I'm going to wrap this with, I don't know, it could be a main, it could be whatever element we want. And then I'm going to throw on a class name here of inter.classname. So now this is putting that class name for the font and the generated fallback fonts and making it available for our entire document. Now, there's one piece missing here, which is I need to tell my application to use the config file. I got to zoom this font doc out. It's a little much for me. So inside here, if I go into next config, I can drop in this config setting that says, hey, we're going to use this font loader for next font Google, and we're going to subset this down to just the English characters in this instance. So I can hit save there, I can hit save here. I will restart my dev server. Let's go back to our local machine, pull up some dev tools here, and zoom out a little bit. And we now have Inter. The difference, maybe I should change to a different font, because the difference between Inter and the system font really isn't that different. It kind of looks somewhat similar, but you can see I have this main element here where the class name is attached. We see the font family of Inter, and we see the automatically generated fallback. So maybe instead we want to do Roboto, and well, I don't think Roboto is a Google Fonts. I don't think Roboto is a variable font. On Google Fonts, you can actually, let's see, how do I fonts? There's a toggle here for only show variable fonts. Let's get one that's a little more fun. Oswald. Okay. Oswald. See how that looks. There we go. Now we've got something that is a little bit more fun. I think it's a great addition. Hopefully you all think it's a great addition. Thanks for tuning in here, everybody who's hanging out in the chat. Appreciate y'all joining in. I'll see if there's any questions on font right now. If you have questions on font while we're here, feel free to drop them in. This was on the image component. If you don't specify width and height props, will it use the layout prop by default? So this could actually be a good time to go back and talk a little bit more about the different layout options. I think they're in the API reference here. But basically, you have fill, which I think you're familiar with from the previous version, but the layouts and how you do layouts has changed a little bit. So I'd recommend still reading through here. I don't know if there's a better code example I can pull up, but maybe I'll pull one up later. But yeah, definitely recommend checking out the fill prop if you want to do what you were familiar with in Next.js 12. So yeah, we've got our custom font here. It's looking, I don't know about y'all, but I think that's looking really good. So yeah, basically, long story short, you can upgrade to Next.js 13 and take advantage of some pretty cool features. But now, drum roll, I know y'all want me to talk a bit about the app directory, which we've talked about before during the layouts RFC phase. We talk about this new direction where we wanted to head in Next.js with this new router that has support for server components and nested layouts and streaming and improved data fetching and all this great stuff. And honestly, I think really the best way to go about this is just to start diving right into the code and just starting to build some stuff. So let's do that here in a second after I answer a couple more questions. Local fonts. Local fonts are just as easy as Google Fonts. So inside of here, basically the API is extremely similar. There's Next Font Google. There's also Next Font Local. So if you have some kind of custom font on your local machine that's not on Google Fonts, you can still use that as well too. And it doesn't necessarily have to be main. It could be really any tag that you want. When I show the example with the app directory, I think I'm putting it directly on the HTML tag, for example. And it go in the concepts of pages, it goes in the app file and not the document file. So I'll show an example with setting up font in the app directory as well. This was just pages directory in Next.js 13. Thank you all for tuning in here. Hey, party people. um, yeah, we might add support for Adobe or another similar font provider or font registry in the future as well too. But without further ado, let's take a look at this app directory. So first, before we start moving things over, I want to quickly plug that we have beta docs, beta.nextjs.org/docs, which is documentation specifically for the app directory. So all the stuff I've talked about so far, you can upgrade to Next.js 13 and take advantage of. You don't have to use the app directory, which is in beta. If you want to use the app directory, which is in beta, you can check out the beta docs, which teach app first. So the part of the reasoning for this is that it's a different mental model, and we didn't want to start introducing this stuff into the stable docs, one, while it was in beta, and two, while you're having to like juggle two different ways of thinking about your application. So let's get started. We're going to, in this instance, migrate an existing application. So we're already on Next.js 13. We don't need to update anything. All of our things are on the latest. We've already talked about images and fonts. There's also scripts that we can get into as well too. But in this instance, we'll just go straight into starting to move things over. So I'm going to just close out my dev server here. I'm going to open up my config file. And step one is that we need to tell Next.js, yes, I want to opt in to using the app directory. It's in beta, so I'm going to specify that inside of my next config file. Boom, problem solved. Next is we need to make a new app directory. And then inside of here, we're going to make our first file, which is our root layout. Now, you'll want to take note of the terminology I'm using here. Root layout means that this layout is applied to every single bit of UI in our application. This is functionally equivalent to app and document inside of the pages folder. So inside of this root layout, I'll just take advantage of this handy copy pasta here. You essentially get some children, just a React child, and you're able to forward that along to the body of your application. And there's basically two things that you have to return in your root layout: HTML tag and a body tag. And this is why it's kind of the merger of _app and _document, because really functionally _document was helping you control that first initial server render and how you sent that HTML document to the page. Whereas app was kind of allowing you to put a context provider or initialize some things that are used across multiple places in your application. It's functionally like a shared layout, right? And the root layout essentially replaces all of this. The next thing here, slight difference from the pages directory, is how you handle meta tags. So previously there was, we probably actually have an example here inside of our existing pages folder. We do. There is next/head. And this head component allows you to override the head HTML tag and put in a title, a meta tag, a link, right? Inside of the app directory, there's a new convention for this, which is head.js or TS or TSX. And this is going to allow you to do basically the same thing. So I can make a new file here. And let's copy paste this in. And for the sake of this demo, I think I'm actually going to move over content from the original application in kind of a piecemeal function. So I'm actually going to go in here and take all three of these meta tags, and I'll kind of just delete it so we can see the code being removed as we go. So I'll just drop these in here. And note that this returns a fragment and not a head tag. And the reason for this is because you can have multiple head.ts files or multiple of these special files, and you're able to kind of combine them or intelligently merge them into one. I will pause here for a second and see if there's any questions. So this app directory that we're kind of diving into today, it's still in beta. We're still working through community feedback, but it's worth trying out today. Maybe not worth moving over your mission critical websites to just yet. I would probably hold off on that, but you can definitely start exploring it and giving us feedback, either on the docs directly or in GitHub. So yeah, let's keep moving. So we have our root layout and we have our head tag with some meta tags here and a title and some other things. Next, we need to tell this new app directory, hey, we need to have a route that we want to navigate to. Now, in the pages directory, this used to be, for example, index.tsx or about.tsx. That routed directly to your route. PM dev. I'll just rerun my dev server here so you can see this. You know, index.tsx, that maps to localhost 3000, you know, your root route essentially, right? In the app directory, it's slightly different. And the difference is that rather than index or blog or whatever you want to call it, the new convention is page.tsx. And it's interesting to dwell on one thing, which is, let me just show you a quick example of why this got a little bit tricky. Let's say I make a new folder blog, and I make a new file inside of here, index.tsx. And I also had a new file, blog.tsx. Which one wins, right? There's two ways of essentially doing the same thing. And that's a problem that is no longer an issue by using the page convention. So for the sake of demo, I'll do that same thing here. I'll make a new folder, blog, and I'll make a new file, page.tsx. And what we can essentially do is, well, let's see, we already talked about all this. We talked about Next.js. I think we can kind of ignore some of that for now. What we can do here is we can just make a function about page, and sure, we'll take that. So I made this new about page slash blog, not about, blog page. And if we navigate in our browser to /about, I need to restart my server. If we navigate in our, it's not about. I keep saying about, it's blog. If we navigate to our blog page, we see this new route. Now notice it looks completely different. Why does this look completely different than our index route? The reason is that these are functionally two completely separate applications. You can kind of think of it. Pages is its own world, and app is its own world. And the reason for this is that it allows you to incrementally adopt it as you're ready. So the global styles that we have here in the pages folder, the shared layout we have in the pages folder, that doesn't necessarily one-to-one map over to the app directory. You get to choose which pieces you want to include. So for example, if I go back to the blog page here, what if we want those global styles, right? Well, what we can do is if you go look at _app, we're doing some interesting stuff in here, right? We've got some global styles. We've got a Google font. So let's actually start looking at what it would look like to copy some of this stuff over. And we're going to do that inside of our root layout. So again, we can import styles. We can use Next font in a very similar way. And in this instance, rather than putting it on the main tag, we could put this font on the HTML tag here. So let's do, I guess it's not enter anymore, but we could this Oswald. This is essentially the same thing as, here we are, applying the dark mode styles that we had from our global styles sheet and kind of using this funky font that we have made available. So yeah, it's pretty interesting. It looks like actually the font didn't go. Did I mess something up? Maybe I messed something up. I think that's right. It was on the wrong tag. I thought it could be on the HTML tag, but maybe I am wrong. Let me double check. That should work. Could be a bug. Maybe it's a bug. Maybe it's just me. I'll have to find out after the stream. But again, this is in beta, so there will be bugs as we work to figure out things. But we have our funky font here. We have our global styles. We have a page. What does it actually look like to move over this index route? Well, the first thing here would be to, let's just drag and drop this file inside here. It's probably going to bust things. Rename index to page, again, because we have this page special file. That's how you denote that /index should route to /page. And inside of here, I think mostly everything should be fine. The styles are in the same way. Next image is in the same way. We already changed next font to use or not next font, next head to use the head.js file. So now if I go back to localhost 3000, I've essentially migrated the index route from the pages directory over to the new app directory. Now, _app, in this instance, we've moved everything away, right? It's all gone. So we could just delete this. Now, if you have multiple routes, right? If you had pages/about.tsx, and this was an about file here, you wouldn't want to delete your app or your document files just yet, because you're still having this separate world inside of pages. But in the instance of this, we can just go ahead and delete these. Now, you might be wondering, what about API routes? And the answer is that for now, nothing changes. You still have API/hello, and I get back my response here. So API routes remain in pages for now, but we will be making some changes here as we move forward in stability. So you can kind of keep those as is for today. I'll quickly pause and see if there's any questions. Hello, hello. Thanks for joining in. How do the link components in the old pages folder and the new pages folder kind of work together? So if I'm on the index route, if I'm on the index route and I navigate using a link component to /about, and about has been incrementally adopted to the app directory, that's going to be a hard navigation or a full page navigation. It won't get the client side transition, because these are effectively, you kind of think of them like two separate applications. What else we got here? What other questions? Question about the naming conventions of server and client as opposed to use client. So there's actually a very interesting, I'll get into server components here in a second. The cool thing about this is we haven't really even had to talk about server components, but we're using server components here, even if you don't realize it. There's a really good discussion on the React working group about the conventions here. And actually, Hydrogen gave a lot of feedback that the .server.client suffixes for file names didn't really work very well, which ultimately led to the React working group decision to change it to use client, which I'll show here in a little bit. And so far, after using it, I'm pretty happy with it. We'll show an example, but other questions. I think that's pretty much it for now. Okay, so let's talk about nested layouts before we jump into server components. Another cool thing about layouts in Next.js 13 is, let's say, for the sake of simplifying everything, I'm just going to make the home page very simple. It's literally just says home page. And we still have our blog page, but what if, not blog/test, what if we want to do something slightly different on the blog page that differs from the root layout? So our root layout, we want our index page to look completely different than our blog page, but maybe we have, 5 or 6 different routes underneath the blog. What we can do is take a similar approach here for a layout and make a new layout.tsx file inside of blog. And in this instance, it's not the root layout anymore. This is the blog layout. We just kind of get rid of all this. And maybe we want to do, we could do like an aside or something. Like maybe you want to have some sidebar on the left of, I don't know, an unordered list of stuff here. I don't know. We'll see what this gives me. Well, we'll just do And then we still need to render out the children. And actually, this entire thing will need to be wrapped in a fragment. That looks about right. Now, again, this isn't super great. We'll just say like maybe this is like a nested sub nav of categories on our blog. Like this is engineering, and this is like, I don't know, what's new or something. What's new? Updates, product updates or something. So we've got our nested categories here. If I navigate back to the index page, we don't see these, right? This is a layout specifically for this route. Now you might be wondering, okay, well, why wouldn't I just put that directly on the page file? Like, isn't that what this is doing? This is where it starts to get interesting with dynamic routes. So you might remember this from the pages folder. If I want to have a series of blog posts, for example, blog/slug, I can still use the brackets that you know and love from pages to define a dynamic route. So in this instance, we've got some slug here, and then inside of here, we can define a new page. And the cool thing here is inside of this, all this like individual blog page, maybe this is, say, like a live stream. We get some lorem ipsum here. Maybe I'll just put this in like a paragraph or something. And then back on our blog page, we could go ahead and just put in, we'll do a link here to post 1 or something. And we'll do an href that's going to link over to /blog/ what do we want to call this one? Stream or something. So now on our blog page, we've got post 1 here. This is a link that's going to link to /stream. Inside of our dynamic route, we have a new page that, you know, this could read in some information about the given slug to render the page differently. But we're missing a critical part here that you might be familiar with in Next.js 12, which is how do we tell the Next.js router that these are URLs that we want to navigate to? How does it learn about the slugs? And we have this fancy function called generate static params. Now, if you're familiar with get static paths, it's very similar to that, where you're essentially defining some number of, in this instance, it's like post. Maybe we want to fetch from our database and get a list of posts and then iterate over those and return, you know, an array of objects like this. For the instance of this, we can probably just hard code this to something like this. And we'll say, what was it, stream that we wanted to call it? Let's call it stream. So in the most basic, like hard coded version, it's basically this. We're telling the Next.js router, hey, there's one route param here that is a slug of stream, and we want to use that. So if I navigate to /stream here, we've essentially made this route available, and it can be statically generated. And we see essentially our blog page. Now, the cool thing here, you might have realized, is the layout, these categories that we have that are shared between not only our individual blog page, but also the main landing page that has the list of posts. And that's because these layouts can be nested. That's the really high level version of layouts. We can go a lot deeper on other additional features that you can use, but I think that's enough of like the 101 level for today, I guess. What other questions do we have here? So I think there was a lot of feedback and questions about Page.js and folks wondering, like, is it going to be confusing to have, you know, files named layout or files named page? A couple thoughts here. One, the example I showed earlier where you could actually have two of the same file inside of pages, like blog/blog, but also /blog/index could resolve to the same thing. that was a problem that is solved by Page. In terms of like finding Page, there's a couple of cool things you can do in your editor. In this instance, like I kind of like just looking at it like this and being able to see like specifically, okay, this is the blog, this is blog slug. I know that these are the routes that it gets addressed to. I think there's some other things you can do with like, I don't remember exactly what the command is. I think it's like a pound sign, but you can search by the React component names as well too. So you could search by blog page, for example. There's some other cool editor things you can do or extensions that can simplify that. But so far in the month or so now that I've been building apps with this new router, it hasn't really bothered me that much. So I'm not too worried about that one. What if we want to have a different layout inside of a nested route? So hopefully that kind of showed what this looks like. Like this layout is inside of this nested route, and we want to change some content conditionally on that. If your question is like, okay, well, what if we want to conditionally show the layout? There's a feature called route groups that we can get into a little bit in the future as well too, but it's probably outside the scope of this. So I want to pause because an interesting thing here is that everything that we've just shown was using React Server components, and you might not have even realized it. And the cool thing about this is that it allows you to build React components in a similar way that you're used to while sending less JavaScript to the client. Now, at the hello world instance, you might be thinking, okay, like what does this actually amount to for me? And what it amounts to is a constant size of client-side JavaScript over time. You have one component, 10,000 components, 100,000 components. You're still going to send the same amount of base JavaScript to the client, which is essentially this React and Next.js runtime. Then you have the option, if you want to add in interactivity on the client side, to add a client component. And that's only when you make the conscious choice that I want to add additional client-side JS. I'm going to make this component that uses state or uses effects or something like that. If you want to learn a little bit more, we have some docs on server and client components that list some of the different things that a server component and a client component can do differently. But just to kind of make a visualization of this, like let's say I'm on this page and I'm like, okay, what I want to do, like set count, and I want to use state from React. And I think if all things are working correctly, I don't know why it didn't give me my auto import. That's fine. Use state from React. If all things are working correctly, you're going to see this, which is a TypeScript error that says, hey, use state is not allowed in server components. Big kudos to the team for their work on this, specifically Shu, that we now ship this TypeScript experience in the app directory, which goes a lot further than what we previously had in Pages. And you might have noticed a while back in the stream, a little thing popped up in VS Code that said, like, do you want to enable the TypeScript? I think it said the TypeScript workspace is the terminology. But basically, if you go to tsconfig, there's this plugin called Next that gets installed in your VS Code workspace. I think there's a .vs Code folder here that shows, hey, you should prompt to use the workspace TSDK. And that's going to give you some advanced IntelliSense, or whatever you want to call this, advanced inference about how you're using things. And it's going to tell you in your editor before you try to do this that, hey, by the way, state and effects need to happen in client components. So then you're like, okay, in that instance, if I want to do a counter of some sort, I need to move that out to a client component. Now, previously, you might have done, okay, let's make a new folder, components, and then add the component in there. Another cool thing about the app directory is that you can co-locate all of your files. So if I want to have a counter in here, and it only makes sense for the blog page, it's like counting, I don't know, counting like likes on a post. You can increment it if you want, right? if it only applies to here, we can just put it directly in the same folder. And because of this page special file, I could put whatever I wanted in here. I could put images, I could put, other React components, I could put style sheets. It doesn't really matter. Anything can go in here because page is the piece of UI that resolves for this route. So I'll just copy over, let's see. Yeah, this is actually, we have a counter example here in the docs. I'll copy over this client side or client component here, and let's just inspect this a little bit. It looks basically exactly like what you're used to for a React component that uses state or effects. You can effectively think about this as everything that existed in Next.js prior to server components in Next.js 13, right? This is how basically all the components used to work, which is they had to send JavaScript to the client to make them interactive. And the way of denoting a client component is specifically this use client directive at the top of the file. And that allows you to do all the fancy stuff you want, like using state or using effects. So now back in my blog page, maybe, maybe back in here, like, I don't know, underneath the header for some reason, we're going to put the counter component, and we just import that from counter. We hit save. Let's see. Yeah, it's in the right directory. Yeah, we import this counter component, and you see you clicked me 0 times. And I can click this and I can increment it just like you normally would, like, simple React component, React state. But the cool thing about this is that this component, this blog page, is still a server component, but you can interweave in client components as you want, as you fetch, whatever you want from the server, and then add that interactivity on the client side as needed. So it's functionally kind of shifting the shifting the default or inverting the default to be server first or server component first, specifically inside of the app directory, right? You can still use the pages directory, which functionally works like all client components today. So if you don't put a page file in the folder, then yeah, it's not essentially considered as a URL path. So, if I really wanted to, inside a blog, I could have a folder for components where these are only components specific, or this could be stories if you're using Storybook or test or something, right? These are just things that are only specific to this folder. And your entire team could work inside of this folder if you wanted. I could even probably move this counter into components. We'll see if my VS Code updates here. Yeah. So it just updated my import into, back up a directory into components. And, it works exactly the same time. We didn't even lose state because of fast refresh here. We still have our React state of the amount of times we clicked it, which is fun. It's pretty interesting. It's pretty neat. There's a couple folks asking about the theme. Yeah, the theme is One Dark Pro. I'm pretty sure One Dark Pro, the darker version, so just slightly darker than the other themes. Yeah, I need to have the easy stream commands that allow people to look up stuff. But yeah, it's the One Dark Pro, slightly darker theme. This is a good question. If you view source, will you see you clicked 0 times, or will you not see the client component at all? Basically, this initial document, if you kind of like, I don't know if you can see my, yeah, you can see my thing. So you can think this entire document as a server rendered or a server component, not server rendered. I think that terminology will be a little confusing for a little bit. It is server rendered, but it's using server components. It's this piece in particular that is not blocking the initial page to be streamed in from the server, right? So if I were to, I think this might work. Disable JavaScript. Actually, I don't know if disabling JavaScript will work on your local. I don't know if it'll work on your local dev machine, or your local dev server. We'll see what we're working with here. It doesn't seem like it's working like I want it to. Basically, what I'm trying to show is that initially you're still going to get this content rendered from the server. It still functions like server rendering in Next.js 12, where the initial document is still turned into HTML and sent back from the Next.js server, but the client-side JavaScript then has to be loaded to make this component interactive, which is not how it works with the server components. We'll get into this a little bit further with streaming too, on like how you can selectively send some content earlier. Maybe we should just do that. Maybe we should just do that next. Let me double check. I was kind of just going along the path here. Oh, I guess before we jump into streaming or suspense, we should probably talk about data fetching, because data fetching is a little bit different inside of the app directory. So let's close all of these and let's make a new. We can just do this on the index route, I guess. So inside of Next.js 12 or 13, inside of the pages directory, you might be familiar with APIs like get static props, get server side props, and similar. Inside of the app directory, it is slightly different. So I think we have a good comparison in here somewhere. Maybe. No. Okay. Well, I'll just start with one example. Basically, you don't need those anymore. Those APIs are gone inside of app. They still work in pages, but inside of app, you can effectively async await your data directly in the component. I have a snippet. I think it's this one. Just to save myself from typing some stuff that shows just like a really simple example here. So let me save this and go back to the index page. I'll just kind of talk through it as we go. So it starts out with a React component like you're used to, but it's marked with async. And then inside of the component, I'm able to use await directly inside of the server component, get the result back here, and then render it out inside of my JSX or my eventual HTML. Now, there's a couple really cool things here. One, I don't have to learn any Next.js specific APIs here. This is just JavaScript. It's just async await, and this is just fetch. Two, this value, since it's server to server, it doesn't get serialized, which means that I'm using TypeScript here. If you notice, I hover over type, it knows that it's a time, right? It could be a date object. It could be any of these other things that previously required additional libraries to manage the serialization. It's not a problem anymore. So you have much better end-to-end type safety here. If I tried to do like type dot, I don't know, something that does not exist, right? It's going to say, hey, you can't do that on a type of time. Another cool thing is that we have extended the web fetch API to allow you to still use the stuff that you are used to, like headers. I can still, send any additional headers I want here, but we can take advantage of caching to dictate whether a page is static, server rendered, or uses ISR. So in this instance, this fetch to go get some data from the world time API, because we denote it with cache no store, this data is going to be refreshed on every page load. As you can see, this time updates in every time. Now, the cool thing about this is like we get some response back. We're able to type this with whatever interface we want here, and then I can just use it directly in the component. I don't have to do anything special. I don't have to have that wild infer data from get server side props thing. It kind of just works. So we recommend doing data fetching inside of server components. Now, one thing you might be wondering is, okay, how do I handle a loading state though? Like I'm fetching some data. Maybe I'm used to like doing a use effect on the client side, and then I needed to have like a is loading state. Next.js in the app directory also include a convention for a loading file that allows you to show some UI or some instant loading state from the server. Before I do that, there's probably a couple questions that I want to get to before I jump into a new topic. So let me answer that first. First off, will we still be able to static export with the app directory? This is a planned feature. If you go over to the docs in the app directory roadmap, you can kind of see what's supported today, what is a planned feature, and what we're probably not going to move to the app directory. So fetch data from the server components and then pass the data as props to the client component. You're exactly right. That is it. Is there support for using on-demand ISR using async components? The answer is yes. It's not fully completed yet. Like the story isn't fully there. You can still use on-demand ISR inside of your API route, like res.revalidate, like this still works today, and it will revalidate the entire route. We're working to make this even better, even more granular. So stay tuned as we make some improvements there. So no need for SWR now. Not necessarily. I think there's still going to be a time and a place for fetching data on the client side, depending on the type of application that you're building. But basically what I'm getting at is that if you're fetching data on the server, you're going to eliminate a lot of the cases where you need to handle that conditional showing of data on the client side, and also sending all that additional client side or JavaScript to the client side to handle that loading state. The cool thing about the loading state, which I'll show here in a minute, like the loading.tsx file or JS file, is that it can be shown instantly from the server, and then the result of, in this instance, this server rendered page can be streamed in as the data is ready. How do you feel about how do I feel? I feel great. How are you doing? How do you feel about Next.js and other frameworks mixing in server logic? I'm a strong believer in a separation of concerns. It makes me uncomfortable. Yeah, I've had a lot of time to reflect on this one, because in the past, like I remember when Next.js originally launched and it had the get initial props, which for all intents and purposes, we can just say is get server side props. It's not, but that's the one that most people are familiar with. So even though we have functions like get server side props today inside of pages, it was never a separation of concern. Wow, that was actually pretty good for Copilot. This was always server code. And it was kind of weird because this code ran on the server, but this code ran on the server and the client. Like the JavaScript was still sent to the client. This, you could use your secrets in here, you could connect to your database, and this was going to get extracted out and put into a separate thing that's server only. But this part in the same file was not necessarily the same, right? You could be forwarding in some props that you had access to from your server, but you just had the props, and now this code ran on both the client and the server. I think, in my opinion, just my opinion, but I actually feel like this is more clear now, because you look at this file, it's a server component by default, and you know that everything here is server only. This isn't being evaluated or ran on the client. Everything here happens on the server. And if I want to opt into the client world, I make it much more explicit now by putting the use client at the top of the file. So I feel like it's more clear. I think it's worth trying out and actually building some stuff with it and seeing how you feel about it. Are new changes revalidated? So yeah, you can still use ISR. I didn't really show an example of that, I guess, but what I could do here is just kind of remove this. Basically, I guess I didn't also talk about this either, but actually, there's a couple things I can talk about here. If I just put in some random value here, this is another cool thing about the TypeScript work. It's like, hey, this is not a valid value for cache. Now, the default here is forced cache. This is essentially making this static. It's static by default. So I could omit this if I wanted to, right? And it would just be static. But if I want to do ISR semantics. Since this is Next.js specific, it's not part of the standard web fetch. It's underneath a specific Next property. So inside of Next, we have revalidate, and we could put this at 60 seconds or something. So that's how I say, hey, this data specifically, I want to revalidate the static data. Excuse me. I want to revalidate the static data on some interval, essentially. Other questions? This is we're already an hour in, and I feel like we're just scratching the surface. So we're probably going to go a little bit longer. Normally I do streams for an hour, but there's a lot of stuff to cover here and a lot of questions. So if y'all are having fun and y'all are hanging out, we can keep going. I like this question. How can we get cookies or headers when using React Server components? And this is actually an interesting one, because if I go back to this world where I'm using something that's server rendered, a pretty common scenario here is where I want to do something like, I don't know, get access to, maybe it's cookies, get access to some cookies and then use that inside of a fetch that I'm making. So, right, inside of here, we have these new server functions, cookies or headers. I can then use this, and maybe I want to get access to, I don't know, like some auth. We have some auth token or something. And then maybe in here, this is like authorization, and we have some JWT that we're including in here. It's like bearer, something like this, right? Like this is something you could do if you wanted to access your cookies. Maybe you want to look at some headers, for example. You can do something like this, get access to the headers here. So this is essentially the same thing as previously pulling those off of the request. I think it was, whoops, I think those are, stop auto-correcting. Request, don't do it. Request dot cookies, I believe, is what it was before, and then I think it was request dot headers before, and get server side props. But yeah, TLDR, yes, you could still do that. What if you want to keep the time counting? So refetch the time every second. You could either do this, it wouldn't really count. It wouldn't really count the way that you want it to if it was server rendered only. I think what you're asking for is like a traditional counter, like an incrementing number, and that would be a client component, because that's probably having some state on the client side. Is there any way to get the path name or the search params in the layout file? So there's a couple other things to note here. First off, on the layout file, there's another param more than just children, which is the params, which is the dynamic route parameters. For a page, you have that, as well as search params. So, this runs on the, I can actually just copy this in if you want to see what it looks like. Basically, this page, it's a server component, so it has access to know if you ran, I don't know, if I did / my index route and I did a query param of ID equals 2, right? I can get access to that through the search params one. In this instance, there are no dynamic params, so this wouldn't be anything here because I'm on the index route. But if I was doing it in this route, for example, I could do that. I think that answers your question. Let me know if that answered it enough. Looks like I answered at least one question. Thank you. How will React Server Components affect context? I would definitely recommend reading. We have some docs on this now. We'll probably be talking about this a lot more. But I guess the TLDR here is, let's say I'm in my root layout. I got to make that a little smaller. Let's say I'm in my root layout and I'm trying to migrate over something. Actually, we might have a section in the upgrade guide. I don't remember. Let me double check. We don't. Okay, that's fine. It's fine. I have some kind of providers, right, that are wrapping my app. Basically, the mental model here is you want your context provider to be as low down in your tree or your DOM as far as possible, because when you enter in a context provider, this is a client component. You're sending this code to the client to make it interactive. So to do that, you kind of want to avoid, doing a wrapping your entire application like this, you know, at this high of a level. Like you kind of want to avoid doing that. Also, since this is a server component, you can't use that context provider directly. Like you can't call that directly inside of here. You need to put it inside of a client component that's marked with use client. So in this instance, right, we have some sidebar here, which, I mean, if we really wanted to, we could probably just throw this in here. Sidebar. I'm going on kind of a side tangent here, but let's go for it. Actually, this might complain a whole bunch because it's not TS, but so I've got some sidebar, and let's import this sidebar. I'll go back over to here. I need to import. Oh, look, I found a typo in our docs. Use context. Now we have this home renders home. If it's open, it's going to show some sub nav here, which, what does this sub nav do? Is this even a thing? This isn't even a thing. So this code example isn't exactly fully out. Let's say open. And then let's say I change this to, I don't know, false. Oops, is that right? I don't know what I'm doing wrong, but you get the point. What about SWR? Good question. Inside of the docs, well, here's a tricky thing about acronyms. You might mean swr.resell.app, the library for client-side data fetching, which I talked about a little bit. You might also mean stale while revalidate cache control headers, which also gets commonly used with the SWR acronym. I'm assuming you're talking about SWR, the client-side library, which I talked a little bit about earlier. You probably want to fetch on the server side. Is there a timeline when Next.js 13 will be out of beta? So just to clarify a little bit, Next.js 13 itself is stable, and you can upgrade and use image and font. Like I talked, you might not have been here at the beginning of the stream, but basically you can use Next.js 13 images and fonts today. You don't have to use the app directory. The app directory itself is in beta. You can incrementally adopt it, as you're ready, but it's not ready for production yet. We're going to be working super hard to get that ready for y'all. Some people are interested in timelines. We're working really hard to get a lot of those features out. Don't have any specifics, but it is something that we're actively working on to get further stability there. I like this question. Like, what if you want to use some other way of fetching data? And I think this is a good time to transition away from this kind of, I don't know, boilerplate create next app here and actually show you something a little bit more. So I've been working on a new version of my website, and I want to just pull that up here, and we can take a look at some code and talk about kind of what's happening here. You're going to notice a couple things. One, that was a cool little animation there. Two, look at those really nice animations across page transitions. And 3, I don't know what 3 is. I haven't got to 3 yet. But I want to talk through some of this stuff because I think it also relates to how you want to use Axios or other abstractions. Let's just jump to that first. I'm going to go talk about this guestbook page. This guestbook is fetching data from PlanetScale. And to do that, it's not actually using fetch. It's using this PlanetScale driver for this Keisley, I guess is how you pronounce it, Kaisley, essentially ORM that allows you to really easily access your database. So it's actually really, really simple. You set up a new instance of this, you tell it what your tables are inside of your database. It's all TypeScript first. I think there's even a plugin where it can like automatically figure out your tables if you want, but I mean, my tables are pretty small, so I don't really have to worry about that too much. And you tell it what your planet scale database URL is, and it gives you type safe access, kind of like a query builder for all of your tables. Another thing which is cool here is I'm using this server only package. Now, currently, this is a separate npm package. This might become a thing that's actually part of Next.js itself, but it will be aliased inside of Next.js because it's more than just Next.js. This is really like a React ecosystem thing. Basically, we're saying that this code, it's using secrets. It should only ever be evaluated on the server. As you can imagine, as the size of these applications eventually grows out a little bit, things will get more complex where maybe I have one component that's static or one component that's server rendered or one that's on the client. And like to make sure to have that security of like, hey, this thing's only ever on the server, you're essentially doing, the technical term here is you're poisoning it. You're saying this thing, no client can ever have access to these the values in here, which is kind of similar to the like next_public inverse of this, which we do for environment variables. So you're like explicitly telling Next.js like, hey, by the way, this is something that is exposed in the client, just so you know, like you're making this conscious choice to use it. Okay, long-winded way of me saying, here's how we connect to Planet Scale. But now if I go to app/guestbook, the page file, this is the actual route that is the addressable route for /guestbook. And the code to do this is so simple. I love it. This is my absolute favorite thing about the app directory. I have some function I'm just calling get guestbook, and I do this type safe query builder where I want to, like, if I did this, right, it's going to be like, hey, that table doesn't exist. So from guestbook, get some information, sort it. And in this instance, I'm only fetching 20, execute it, and return this data back to our component here. And like, this is the coolest part to me. I did nothing. And if I hover over entries, I have type safe access. Like it shows me exactly what fields I have available. When I'm iterating over these, if I like made a typo here, it's like, hey, updated at is not the value that you are looking for, which I think is so cool. Like there's basically no boilerplate here. It's just await and then get data. There's no get server-side props or no concepts that I have to mess with here. It's just, you just get the data. But this isn't a fetch, right? So you'll notice this export const dynamic here that's saying, yes, this isn't a fetch. So I can't do the default of caching this as static, but I can tell this route that I want this to be statically generated. And again, thanks to some TypeScript magic, I think I'm drinking the TypeScript Kool-Aid, because even if I mess this up here, it still is going to tell me without, I don't have to import like, some kind of special typing here that's something like that. Like it's able just to magically figure this out for me. It's super cool. So, maybe I want for static, maybe I want, I'm trying to think if I can get it to just, yeah, it even pops over my options for me. Auto, force dynamic, air, force static. There's more on these in the docs, but just the fact that that works is super cool. Then basically, I'm using Tailwind here. So I just iterate over the different things, and that's how I essentially create my guest book. It's really that simple. I'll pause for questions before I dive more into the new version of my site. So many things about Apter. I think this is a good thing to like pause and think about. You don't have to learn all of this in one day, nor do I expect anyone to. There's a lot of new concepts here, and it's okay if you don't know them right away. If it takes a little while to figure these things out, I'm still figuring them out myself. I'm still learning all the new mental models and concepts around the app directory. And again, it's in beta. So try it out. Let us know how you think. And your feedback will help dictate the type of educational content that we put out. So if there's parts that are really confusing, just let us know. I can keep going with more questions. So feel free to ask more questions. Your blog at Apter. Yes, that is what we'll show here in a second. We've got at least part of it pulled up. Can we fetch data from any server components or just pages? You can fetch data in any server component, including components. So if I want to do some deeply nested component like inside of here, that can also be a server component, and that can also fetch data as granular as we want, not only in a page, in a layout, or really anywhere. It's super, super awesome. Is there a new router? There are new routing hooks. Yes. There is next. Let's see if I can find it. There's of course cookies. There's fetch headers. All these things run on the server. There's also use router, which is now called Next Navigation because use Next router also works for pages, right? There's also some additional stuff here like getting search params, layout segments, path name. Like there's a bunch of stuff there that we could dive into. If you're learning Next.js, I would still recommend like starting with the pages directory if you're trying to put an application into production. But if you've been around for a while or you're just trying to grapple with some of the new stuff, it's helpful to know the direction where the framework is going. And that is towards the app directory on a long enough period of time. What other questions do we have here? When to use the hook or async await in a component. Basically, if you're doing data fetching inside of a server component, you should just use async components or async await. The ideal use is when you'll be fetching data on a client component, but most of the time you probably don't need to fetch data on a client component unless you're building, a very particular type of application. If we want to use context for the blog, we wrap the blog layout and not the root layout. That's exactly right. Basically, you want to put that as far down in the React tree as possible. I joined the stream late. Have you talked about animation? I have not. You joined the stream at the perfect time. I'll pause there before I get to the rest of the questions because I do want to show this. I think it's really cool, and it's actually really simple to do. So if I go to my root layout, well, fun fact, this is actually showing using local fonts instead of Google Fonts because I have some versions of this Kaise font here. So my root layout, which applies to every route in my application, I get this fun little moving div here as I transition across pages. And this was possible to do in the pages folder. It was just really not very intuitive and kind of difficult to do. But because this doesn't re-render when I navigate across pages, like this component is able to very easily do animations. So inside of our root layout, we have this sidebar component. This is a client component, right? Because we have some state. So let me open up sidebar. Basically, I have a few navigation items, home, blog, guestbook. I have some X and Y positions and a width. Now I'm using these because I want to tell, I want to tell Framer Motion how to animate things. This is essentially all it takes. I have a motion.div, which is this square. I'm giving it some styles. I'm telling it, hey, initially be zero opacity and use the Y value based on the navigation item, right? So if I'm on guestbook, and this is, this is the, what you're looking at here is the desktop version, which is using the Y value. So notice it's going up and down. When I reload the page on guestbook, I want the initial position of this to be the Y value of guestbook. But then when I animate, I want to change the Y value of this to whatever is specified for that navigation item, right? And the transition, I'm saying we want it to feel like a spring. We want it to feel very fluid, very real. That's basically all it takes to do that. And a little quirk of my layout of my site here is that I have kind of a completely different layout on mobile and desktop. So fun little fact here, this might be obvious, but I feel like it's something that comes up a lot when I'm building UI, is when you want to do something different on mobile and desktop, but it's actually like you're trying to do it in JSX and you're not trying to do it, like you don't want to pull in a React hook to like check the viewport to decide if you're on mobile. One thing that works pretty well is just actually using CSS class names to toggle or show different elements. Now, caveat, this doesn't work for everything. You probably don't want to do this and put 10,000 extra elements into your DOM. But for like a 2-item thing here, it's kind of nice that I can just do, tailwind here, display hidden, and when it's on mobile, or show it when it's on desktop, and then just have the same thing here, slightly different, because we're animating the X values here. So it's really that simple to do animations with Framer Motion. It's super, super awesome. Now, you could extend this exact same thing to your layout file and do page transitions as well too. Or you could do it really as granularly as you want. But the cool thing here, and the reason why it's so easy in the app directory, is because only the part of the page that changes re-renders. So that's why when I'm changing these routes, going from blog to guestbook, I can still make these transitions between pages. Will there be a change in MDX? Yeah, we haven't really published any guidance on using Markdown in the app directory. We will do that. It's on the plan. Features. GraphQL, you can, of course, you can still use GraphQL in the app directory. You can do a fetch directly using GraphQL, or you can still use, some kind of wrapper library, and you would be doing something more akin to this. Like if this is a GraphQL client and it's, fetching something, since you're not using the underlying fetch where you can set the cache policy directly on it, you can set it using this segment option here. Oswald is a pretty cool font. Thank you. Where does the API routes folder go? It remains in pages for now. I love type safety. I also really love type safety. How close are we on a release? We are getting there. We are getting closer towards working on some of this stuff. But yeah, it's still in beta as we're working through community feedback and some early bugs, which, by the way, is a good place to talk about. Even if you tried this out on 13, I guess I'm not even on 13.2 yet. 13.2 has even more bug fixes if you're using app. So definitely update to 13.2. Any reason to have multiple exports like this versus exports config, something like this, which is interesting because we did explore this. And my understanding is that it's actually, there's a couple of reasons, but one of the big ones is it's actually easier to type this without having to introduce a specific thing that you need to import, right? So without having to do like next config, it's really like route segment config, rather than having to do this, or whatever the equivalent is. It just, the TypeScript plugin just automatically figured out. Less code you have to type, essentially. Other questions? How can you refetch your guestbook in order to avoid stale data in this example? Great question. So when I showed in kind of the Create Next application, I was able to do, I don't know, res await fetch, something like this, and there was some URL, and then type. Sure, post, whatever. No, it's not a post. I just like accepting whatever Copilot throws at me. This is essentially what I was showing before, right? I was showing, that's not for static. This is where TypeScript comes in handy. My brain already is not, is already not doing it right. What is it? Let's see, does it show me it? Force cache, not for static. This is how I was doing it before, but when I'm using a query builder, an ORM or Prisma, or like whatever I want to use, I can't do that. And I also showed the next revalidate thing, right? So 10. The equivalent of this, when you're using a query builder or something, is these route segments here at the top. So I can do export const revalidate equals, and if I just did like this, right? It's gonna be like, hey, well, first off, what the heck is that? Second, that's also not valid because this needs to be a valid value. it really needs to be something like this. Now TypeScript is happy, right? And a fun fact, you can also write this like this. So you can also do it like that if you want. They don't have to be separate lines, but it's kind of similar to the config layout where it's all one object. But yeah, you can do it like that too if you want. So hopefully that answers your question. Question about excuse me, about deployment. So when you deploy, you can choose where your code is executed. Can you combine like a serverless and an edge function? The answer is yes. Basically, you can choose maybe for one route you want it to be an edge function. For one route you want it to be a serverless function. Yeah, absolutely, you can do that. Hello, welcome. Thank you for joining. What about doing mutations like put and post request? Yeah, I'm happy to quickly pull up some code and take a look at this. I won't go into it too far because this is going to change, and we'll be doing more guidance on this soon. But here's a short look at what this looks like. Basically, in this example, I'm fetching some to-dos. I get a list of things. I iterate over them. This to-do is a client component. And inside of this to-do, I have a checkbox. And when I click on the checkbox, it makes a mutation, right? It says, okay, I want to update. This update calls a fetch. It's like a put or a post or something. It takes in some data. The magic value here, this is how it works currently, is router.refresh. And this allows you to essentially go fetch new data. Now, this is essentially kind of just temporary. We're working on a new RFC for making this even better. But if you want to do mutations today, you can make it work through that. Yeah, you can still send data to the server using post. Nothing changes there in the app directory. How can we send a request based on a user agent? So you would be able to use the headers function to pull off the user agent. Glad you enjoyed the transition here for the nav bar. What is motion.div? Motion.div is from Framer Motion. I'd highly recommend checking that out. Framer.com/motion. Basically, it just makes animations really easy. There's other animations libraries you can use, but I found that one to be pretty easy. Any difference on how to configure Tailwind when using the app directory? Nope. It basically works exactly the same. I'm actually using Tailwind on my blog here, so I didn't really have to change anything too much. It kind of just works. Yeah. Is there? Let's see. That I already answered that one. Question about TurboPack. So when can TurboPack be used on larger projects? For now, there is definitely a few things that TurboPack doesn't yet support. Working on that as well too. It's in alpha, so that one is very early. Lots to do in the TurboPack space, but you can try it out on like the kind of the Hello World examples are working, and just more basic things with Next.js like CSS modules or things like that. But yeah, we're working on making that even better. Any example with the suspense API? Yes. So actually, I realized that we didn't even talk about that yet, but it is a fun one to talk about. Maybe I can just do a stream. Make a new folder called stream. I'll do a new page. And then I have a snippet, I'm pretty sure, for suspense. Oh, my navbar component is like, hey, you didn't tell me about this layout. What are you doing here? Let me go to my. I'll just comment this out for now. Don't need to use the sidebar. So this is a incredible example. It just all it does is show a couple different timers, but it kind of illustrates the point of how you use suspense. So we'll kind of step through this piecemeal here. Inside of our page here, we have 3 different suspense boundaries, and each of them has this fallback of loading. Now, the first one, it's just some arbitrary delay of 100 milliseconds. The second one, or 1,000 milliseconds. So a second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. And again, since this is going to be doing essentially just mocking out what a real data fetch looks like, it just kind of illustrates the fact of like you can get as granular as you want here when you're sending in different data. So like this first one, it could be a sidebar. The top one, it could be a navigation bar. The third one, it could be like a smaller part of the application down on the bottom. Now this works. You can definitely do this. Another option is that you can use loading UI. So maybe we want to do like the guest book. Let's just put like loading.tsx, export, default function, loading, return, loading. And then I'll go to the guest book page. Book. It happened pretty fast there. Somebody's here live watching the Next.js stream at 4 a.m. So thank you for tuning in. You'll notice that you see that loading here. Now, this is obviously a super trivial example, but it highlights something very interesting, which is since we can use this loading file to instantly show that loading state from the server, and then as this data is ready, you can stream it in to the client side as it resolves. So in a hello world example, it doesn't really look that interesting, but this can return basically whatever you want. This could be a very fancy skeleton. We actually have a better example here that better imitates what a real UI would look like. Like this part is a suspense boundary. This part is the suspense boundary. I want to stream in different pieces of content as they're ready. This is a more realistic look at what a UI with this same concept and the same concept show before can be used to build. So yeah, loading's pretty neat. It's pretty cool. Are there any known bugs with Next.js 13 in the app directory? Yeah, there's certainly bugs. It's in beta. We are working to get all of them addressed. Light mode, dark mode. Yes, it does have light mode, dark mode support because it's using Tailwind's. Tailwind has it through somewhere. Actually, I think it's just on by default if you just use the dark mode classes. But if I change my system preferences, it works. Can you have custom page extensions in the pages directory, or will it conflict with the naming conventions in the app directory? So nothing changes about the pages directory, but if you want, you could put any file. Actually, I have a good example here. I have images and CSS inside of this new directory. You can have any extension that you want here. So functionally, pages and app kind of act as separate applications. Am I using suspense at all in my blog? I don't think I am right now. Mostly my blog it will be completely statically generated, I think. I probably will use ISR for the guest book. So I'm glad that we talked through the revalidate thing a little bit here today. I just haven't got to it yet, but slowly getting there. How to add next font class in the Tailwind config. Yeah, this is in the docs, and I can show an example here too, because now, I'm using Tailwind on this site. Basically, there's only one slight difference, which is after you set up your fonts, whether they are local or from Google Fonts. Whoops. I'm just going to uncomment this so we can still have it. Basically, the only difference here is that rather than using .class name, you use .variable. And .variable is going to set a CSS variable that you can then use inside of your Tailwind config. So I've extended the font family. I'm saying, hey, if I want to use a serif font, aka font serif, the CSS class name, then use this CSS variable of font kaze, which allows me to make this heading. If I actually save and go back to guestbook, you can see it right here. Font serif for the guestbook is how I make this one use the custom font. So it's pretty much the same thing, slightly different. Thank you for the compliment here. I'm starting learning HTML, CSS, JavaScript. Is it better to learn React before Next.js or not? So I would say that you can learn them both at the same time. One resource that could be helpful is to go here. Zoomed in a little bit, but we have this learn course on nextjs.org/learn that also talks a little bit about even more than React. It talks about from JavaScript, like, hey, I want to build a page using HTML and JavaScript. How do I actually get to there? This course takes you all the way from JavaScript to React, React to Next.js, and then into Next.js. And then hopefully, I think it also links out to some of the React docs along the way too that you can go much more in depth on. The React docs are very excellent. I recommend reading these as well. So you can kind of do both. I feel like we need React 2035. Yeah, I didn't. So for context, I made a course called React 2025. I didn't expect React to evolve this much in a short amount of time. Like this is a welcome change. I'm very excited about it. But yeah, it's a little bit different than what I had initially expected, but a pleasant change. Maybe I will make another course. I think that'd be kind of fun. I kind of answered this a little bit further, but yeah, you can still use SWR or just in general client side fetching for some things, but you don't necessarily need to if your only goal was to co-locate your data fetches with your components, right? Like for example, let's say on this page, actually, this could be a good example. On this page, on my home page, I have some content here that is dynamic. And if I scroll up to the top, I have homepage and I'm doing two different data fetches here. This is not optimized. This is definitely not the best it could be because this is awaiting something and then awaiting something else. But I'm still building this. I want to prevent that. What the next step here is that I actually want to pull this out into its own component. So maybe we just do that to demonstrate this. So maybe this is blog views.tsx. Actually, I think I already started using this casing, which maybe I'll change it. Maybe I won't. I don't know. I'll just copy paste all this over. Specifically, the piece that I'm looking for here is blog views. So I have, just delete all this, delete a whole bunch of stuff. I have a fetch to plant scale to get the number of views for my blog. And really all I need inside of this component is this fetch plant scale. I'm going to call it static. We'll call this component blog views. I can get rid of all of the other code that's not related to this. And then I think we really only need probably just this div. Oh, it's actually even less than that. It's just this paragraph. So all this other stuff on my homepage, yeah, I don't really need any of this. I want to co-locate my data fetch with my component. So now I have this pretty simple component. I have blog views. It renders out a p tag with an SVG right here, and it then uses the result of the data fetch in line here. Here's my data fetch. That's really all I needed to do. And now if I go back to page, I could, refactor this out, get rid of that here, get rid of that here, go down to, let's see, where's that here? This paragraph, yeah. And I could delete this and just do blog views. And I could, refactor all this stuff out. as much as we want. There's a little TypeScript weirdity here that we're also working on with the TypeScript team, which is basically TypeScript is like, wait a minute, this is a promise because you have an async component, and we have some workarounds for that as well too. But we're working on fixing that upstream as well. Is Next.js production ready? Next.js 13. Yes, it is production ready. You don't necessarily have to use the app directory if you don't want to, but you absolutely can. It's just in a beta state. So I probably wouldn't put the app directory in production just yet. We're still working on adding support for like better modal routing or dialog routing inside of the app directory. That just hasn't landed yet. Is there a recommended project structure? Not necessarily. The cool thing about the new app directory is it addresses a piece of feedback that a lot of people had actually, which is like, hey, just let me control how I put my files. Like, I want to put my styles next to my pages. Please. I want to put my images in there. Yes. Style sheets. Yes. And now it's kind of up to you or your team to figure out which convention you want to put on top of this. So you don't have that restriction necessarily. While there is still the convention of file system based routing, that's kind of where we're drawing the line. We still want to use the file system. We still want to have special files like page and layout. You can still put kind of whatever you want here. Now, of course, you could still have a separate components directory if you wanted to. You don't necessarily have to do it this way, but you certainly can. Question about sessions and authentication. I'll talk to this in another stream. Probably not going to have enough time today, but Next.auth, which is a community library, has just updated and added support for using auth inside of server components. So I'd recommend checking that out as well too. Any recommendations for a CMS that integrates well with any of these new features? So one of the cool things is that because data fetching is kind of agnostic, this could be me querying from PlanetScale. It could be me querying from Supabase. It could be me querying from, I don't know, some SQL server that's running in the back room in my house. It could be me fetching from Sanity or Contentful or any of these headless CMSs. It's really either just a fetch or some abstraction on top of the fetch. That part necessarily hasn't changed. Like there's still that separation of you can use Next.js in kind of a headless way. You have your data sources somewhere else. You want to pull in those data sources and put things on the page. Nothing essentially changes there. Another question about folder structure. Yeah, I don't really have any strong preferences. I'm personally going to start throwing everything inside app just because it wasn't possible and now it is, and I think it's great. I just noticed a typo in your bio. Yeah, I can't spell, so I'm not surprised. I need spell checking inside. Actually, that would probably be a nightmare because I think everything was wrong. But yeah, maybe I need spell checking on my page. Man is super excited about the front end. Yeah, I am really excited about the front end. It is fun. Working with this new app directory has been a lot of fun. I think there's a lot more to talk about here. I feel like we're an hour and 40 minutes in, and I feel like I'm just scratching the surface of a lot of these topics. It can go way deeper in a lot of them as well too. But I think this is a good place to kind of kick things off for the next stream. I'll end on this one. This updated Next.js makes me feel like we're getting back to vanilla JS with some abstractions, which seems to be simpler than using a bunch of additional libraries. And this is kind of the sentiment that I'm really excited about with a lot of this, which is it's like in its simplest case, it is very, very simple. Like the example of data fetching, like this example is just absolute chef's kiss to look at. Like you just async await, it's just JavaScript. It's just React. You just render JSX, which is, kind of React's whole thing is like, it's just JavaScript anyway. So it's like, you're just back to these fundamentals, and you're also using the web platform APIs. Like if you want to use fetch, okay, how do I add headers to a fetch? I just go to MDN and I look at the docs for fetch, right? Like you probably already know how to do that because it's the same API that you use in the browser, right? And with Node.js and Edge runtimes and every place that allows you to fetch data, all kind of standardizing on the same way of doing fetch. All of that knowledge transfers, which I think is very, very exciting. So yeah, we can end with this. Is there a starter repository to try out Next.js 13? Absolutely. So you can type in create next app at latest if you want to start out with Next.js 13. If you want to use the app directory and try things out, I believe it is experimental app is the flag you pass. Yes, experimental app. If you're doing that, highly recommend. Well, if you're starting from scratch, I'd recommend just doing it this way and checking out the beta docs. Make sure you read the foundations, the fundamentals pages. If you're upgrading an existing app, definitely check out the upgrade guide, which will teach you how to slowly move things over to the app directory. But yeah, hopefully this stream has been helpful. I know I went deep on some things, but not enough. Like there's still a lot more to cover that we will definitely get to in the future. I'll have to do some more streams. I know it's like kind of getting dark in here now. My huge light is like blinding me a little bit. It got dark out real fast, real quick. But thank you all for joining. This was fun. Really good questions. Let me know what you want to see in the next stream as we kind of dive even a little bit further into some of this stuff. I know I barely talked about loading states, barely talked about streaming. We can get into that a little bit more as well too. But thank you all for tuning in, and have a great rest of your morning, afternoon, or evening. Shout out to the one person watching it at 4 a.m. See y'all.